Today, we're exploring the critical topic of nitrogen use efficiency in dairy farming systems. And so this webinar today will offer fresh perspectives and practical solutions for sustainable livestock production. For today's forum, we have three speakers who will be talking to us from different angles and perspectives on this topic. And the first speaker that will be talking to us today is Dr. Jo. Dr. Jo Newton is the president of the Victorian and Tasmanian branch of the Australian Association of Animal Sciences and currently works across the dairy bio and dairy feed-based programs for Agriculture Victoria, where she uses a multidisciplinary approach in developing and valuing decisions, support tools that enable more informed breeding and management decisions on farm. Thank you, Jo, for joining us today, and I hand over to you for your presentation.
Thanks, Arpe. The Australian Association of Animal Sciences is grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with TIA on today's Future Forum. The Australian Association of Animal Sciences, or AAAS, is the professional association for animal scientists, consultants, industry professionals, including farmers, and students in Australia. We're a member of the World Association of Animal Production, the Asian Australasian Society of Animal Production, and the British Society of Animal Sciences. Our role is to help build industry capacity by providing a support network for members, access to the latest scientific updates, professional development opportunities, links throughout our member network, as well as delivering local and national events. I'm excited to say that we have a newly revamped website with an improved members-only area, and we can say a big thank you to our new Executive Officer, Kylie Faulkner, who has delivered that website for us. On top of this, we have access to journal subscriptions, a monthly email newsletter, and advertised positions vacant. As a member, as well as access to the members area of the website, there's an opportunity to apply for travel grants, scholarships, submit papers for our conference, and other opportunities, such as applying to chair our conference sessions. We have 2 international travel awards annually, valued at $4,000 each, and they're open to all members. We also have early career awards, recognise distinguished lifetime service to animal sciences through our AAAS Fellows program, and our individual branches also offer scholarships as well. For example, there were 11 branch scholarships to support attendance at our 2024 Congress. And individual branches also choose to sponsor members for other activities as well. I personally joined AAAS in the thick of COVID. And so for me, the opportunity to grow my network has been a key part of what's kept me involved with AAAS. AAAS is a platform for industry networking and connections, growing personal and professional skills, and contributing to committees, events, and activities from early career communications, our awards and fellowships, and of course, our state and national branches. And also an opportunity to share updates with the rest of the membership via the communications form. AAAS has a range of events and activities. Our regional branches support local activities, both in person and online, either as standalone events or collaborations, like today's Future Forum. Every 2 years, we hold a conference, and our 2026 conference is being held in South Australia from the 14th to the 16th of July next year. One-page paper submissions are now open and will close on the 16th of November next year. So I encourage you to get those one-page papers in and make sure you're signed up for updates for the 2026 conference if you're not already. Anyone working in animal sciences can sign up to become a member of the AAAS. You can sign up at any time throughout the year, and that will give you a 12-month membership with a reminder the following date when it's due. We offer discounted fees for students and early career professionals. We also offer a membership pause during parental leave. And membership is also free to all undergraduate students. We'd be really grateful for those of you that have teaching commitments if you can help promote that aspect with your students. Got the website on the page, as well as a QR code where you can go and see our newly revamped website and also consider joining as a member. That's enough from me. I'm sure we're all eager to hear from our speakers today.
Thank you very much, Jo, for that presentation on AAAS. If you have any question for Jo about joining AAAS, you can use the question and answer button to let Jo know, and I'm sure she'll be able to respond to your question. So I'd like to bring up our second speaker today. Our second speaker today is Pieter Raedts. Pieter is originally from the Netherlands and is currently working as a research fellow in the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture's dairy team, focusing on animal nutrition, feed-based, irrigation, and precision farming technology research. Pieter has extensive experience with a large variety of farming systems. He is one of the lead researchers in the multi-year farmlet trial that's going on at the Institute Dairy Research Facility. Thank you, Pieter, for joining us, and I hand over to you for your presentation. Pieter, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Looks like you're muted. Yeah, I think you're muted, Pieter. So.
Okay, should be okay now.
Yes, we can hear you now. You can go back to your slide.
So, as a research fellow within the Livestock Production Center of TIA, I'm involved in sustainable inputs research, and that's where I will be speaking about mostly today, with a focus on nitrogen use efficiency. When we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, in our case, we focus on dairy cows. It is on itself initially fairly straightforward. It's about inputs, and these inputs are for the cow basically just feed, and the outputs is then milk and meat. They grow a bit, a calf might be developing and so on, and of course the excreta. And on itself, with NUE, you get a fairly simple equation. If, say, the output is 40 kilos of nitrogen in truly produced product, milk and meat, and the input is 160 kilos, the end use efficiency is 25%, because the excreta is not seen as an output that produces something of value. Given we have a pasture-based system where cows graze grass, we actually have to look at it in nitrogen use efficiency much more from a systems perspective. So we actually have to include the farmland that is used for feed production. And but what you see then is that excreta actually drops on that farmland and is normally in a pasture-based system not exported. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but normally that just stays within your farmland. So at a systems level, input is purchased feed, purchased nitrogen, anything that you purchase. There might even be legumes fixing some nitrogen from the air, and deposition is normally not much. And these exports then occur, and the difference are seen as a surplus, and they might lead to losses, and that's why it's important to look at nitrogen use efficiency at the systems level. This is a graph produced by Cameron Gourley in the past. What you see here is a graph that actually shows in much more detail, just to show the complexity, the inputs and outputs. Inputs, as you can see, there's a large range. There are a few that are very important. There are a lot that are minor components. The outputs ultimately for productivity are mostly milk and animals, but there might be some export of manure crops and the like. Ultimately, it is here where we have the risks, the losses, where leaching and runoff is the most known. That's where worldwide a lot of legislation is formed around. The nitrogen can end up in streams, in groundwater, as nitrate might quite often, and therefore legislation tries to reduce these kind of sources. Soil accumulation of nitrogen can be good or bad. It really depends on what happens with that in the future. It is kind of accumulation of organic matter initially, and if that is used well, that might not be the biggest issue. The gaseous losses, however, are a different story. We know that out of pasture, nitrogen oxide can emit as gas, but in animal systems, one of the things you quite often see, and for dairy cows that is not different, when manure as a mixture of feces and urine is mixed, what you get is a high risk of ammonia volatilization that occurs out of these systems. Now, if you have a pig or poultry farm, a closed-in housing, you can have fans extracting the air through an air washer that then grabs that ammonia, washes it out, and that can then quite often be used as a fertilizer. Dairy barns, however, are quite often naturally ventilated, so don't have that opportunity. And in a pasture-based system, that there is no housing, so that is a risk that can occur. However, if you look at a pasture-based system, what happens over there is that manure and so the feces and the urine fall separate from each other, so the ammonia volatilization is a lot less. So I will be talking a little bit of about our founder trial later, and I made a bit of a calculation, but the difference of ammonia volatilization out of a house system compared to having the cows in a paddock could well be 30 kilos of N per hectare per year being lost more from house systems. That's why some countries in Europe have issues with that and have legislation reducing the ammonia volatilization. There are, by the way, now systems available that can grab some of that ammonia out of dairy barns too. Here, a bit of an overview produced as a guideline of ranges of losses that occur. You see nitrogen use efficiency as percentage, and that's a surplus per hectare mentioned here in kilos N. And as you can see, if I focus on Australia as a whole farm, you see that what was found in the past had a huge range, high losses to almost no losses. And that is an indication that it is very important, not just what you do, but how you do systems on your farm. We have to keep in mind, though, that these higher levels might be partly stored manure on farm, because under dry conditions, it might be that cows receive a lot of input from purchased feed, which then might be manure in a paddock that grows crops later. Anyway, if you look at grabbing on average the lowest values and on average the highest values, that is roughly a practical range that you can see that most situations should have with a minimum middle value mentioned. What can we do with NUE at the cow level? It's basically try and have the diet as good as possible, where cows are different in the sense that we actually for 70% feed the rumen bugs. So we do have a part of the protein that is degraded in the rumen. Ammonia is formed if there are sufficient carbohydrates as energy source. Microbes multiply, they form binded ammonia, build it into microbial food protein, and that is then available as metabolizable protein, and we can have some rumen undegraded protein also being available for that. Balancing this within a diet means that you can improve the nitrogen use efficiency at the cow level. However, if I look at the diet of a cow, 33 liters, 23 kilogram matter intake, so a decent feed conversion efficiency, pasture-based diets, grazing cows might well have a diet of 20% crude protein, so you only get an NUE of 24%, but even a diet that is balanced extremely well doesn't bring the NUE better than about 30%, because most cows will have within this system about 16% crude protein as the lowest crude protein that they can have in the diet. So as you can see, if this is balanced well, there's a lot of used N. There will still be some form of wasted N, mostly through urea. And urea is actually diffusing through the body too, not only excreted as urine. And that diffusion actually provides an advantage in the sense that in a dairy system, you can use milk urea nitrogen. A little bit of that urea diffuses in milk. That concentration in milk can be used as a guidance of where you are aiming to be with your cows. Did it from our farmer trial that I'll be speaking about, the different farmers, fortnightly herd test of the full daily milk. Milk urea, if it's very low, it might mean there's not enough protein in the diet. That's roughly the bottom line that I have here as a threshold, and above this line there's truly a surplus of nitrogen in the diet. So that's something that can be easily used as an indicator to manage cow level stuff. However, we have to look at it at the hectare level, and what you see here is what we did on our farm is as a sustainability trial, see if we can improve the nitrogen use efficiency by reducing the synthetic N input, so the fertilizer to make grass grow. For that, we set up a trial with 4 treatments, a farmlet trial as we call it, so run farm systems at a small scale over a long period of time. What I will be talking about is preliminary data. We have just started the 3rd and last year, so this is all indicative what I'm talking about. The design was conventional levels of nitrogen per hectare per year to halving, and even one treatment sits at 0. Our aim was to still produce a lot of grass per hectare or pasture per hectare and have a high milk production. So these targets seem to be achievable. We have done quite well with these in general. You will see in this mixture some plantain, and that was one of our observations. It didn't really survive. Here you see the design in a different way on our research farm. Here in northern Tasmania, we made 8 blocks, 4 paddocks in each block, randomized which treatment got which paddock. And here you see the layout of the trial where if you reduce synthetic nitrogen and you still want to grow grass, that grass still needs nitrogen to grow. You have to find other ways of getting that nitrogen in. And we used a legume, clover. Legumes have a symbiosis with rhizobia bacteria on their roots, and these rhizobia bacteria can fix nitrogen out of the air. So that's what we used to try and graze grass, similar amounts for these farmlets compared to the control. Everybody would say no synthetic nitrogen use will result in less grass grown, and we start to see that. There's probably about 15-20% less, so we have slightly less cows on that treatment. So that is how it is looking like when we are in a full grazing season. So the diet, mostly grazed pasture, they all get concentrate, roughly about 25% of the total dry matter intake over the season. And if there's a feedback, so feed gap, so not enough pasture growing, when it gets colder in autumn, then we use a bit of silage to fill a feed gap. So our key observations are pasture production is on target. So we have high pasture production. The zero synthetic N is still producing well. So there must be some form of sufficient N coming around. And at the cow production level, what we found is that the dry matter intake and cow production was above expectation. And that is mostly, it seems, due to the fact that we have a lot of clover in our paddocks, 20–30% during the season of the dry matter that the cows can consume. And what you see here is that the amount of fiber called NDF in rumen nutrition is much lower than ryegrass. Cows can only eat a certain amount of NDF, of a certain amount of fiber, and if you have a diet components in it that are lower, normally the total intake can increase, and that is what we saw. So we have a very high total dry matter intake relative to the cow size, so as percentage of body weight. And I looked at some other data, even high performing TMR diets, extremely well controlled, I'd sit below 4% of body weight, and our cows were doing 4.1. So that is an outstanding result, and we hope to investigate that a bit further. What that does is help in the productivity and therefore in the use, the intensity of nitrogen use efficiency. How did we have our nitrogen use efficiency? If I simply only look at the imported N, we have a certain amount of nitrogen going in from concentrate, silage, fertilizer. There's export in milk and meat, and farmlet 4 had a little bit of silage surplus. What you do see is that the surplus between Tasmania is the Tasmanian dairy farming system, the averages that we see in benchmarking that we based our trial on. So that is what farmers currently roughly are doing. And our farmlet 1 is a derivative of it. Our control is based on that. And as you can see, our control sits at a similar level based on imported nitrogen use efficiency. But farmlet 4 is negative, and you would be mining nitrogen. And that's what you normally see. Organic farms have a productivity that is lower, quite often 30% or so. However, we saw a better production, and that is because this leaves one thing out, and that is the nitrogen use efficiency that we have the nitrogen import. I actually should say nitrogen derived from the air through rhizobia. We investigated and we saw activity of the rhizobia on the root nodules. And if I take that into account too, you see that farmlet 4 will have a very high amount of nitrogen derived from the air going in. We, however, also found that even farmlet 1 had some activity of these rhizobia, so it's also deriving some air nitrogen, despite nitrogen from fertilizer being at that high level. So you see that if you want to improve the surpluses per hectare, you have to take all components of all sources of nitrogen into account, because you see you might even be creating a bigger surplus. The end use efficiency, however, is still as a percentage better because of the high export of milk that we have due to the high productivity that I mentioned. If I look at this from the perspective of intensity, so these values are the same as from the previous slide, and I then look at the much higher milk production that our farmers had due to clover in the diet, higher dry matter intake, and all that extra energy and that extra dry matter can go towards milk production, isn't needed for maintenance energy. We see that we have a milk production that is much higher than what farmers have, even farmlet 4, which had a lower stocking rate than farmlet 2 and 3. And if you would look at that in that way, we actually have a surplus per hectare corrected for the amount of milk produced. And here in Tasmania or Australia and New Zealand, it is common to describe milk production as milk solids. So MS stands for milk solids, the kilos fat and protein produced, because that's what the farmers get paid for fat and protein, not liters of milk. So you can see that if we look at the intensity, it is actually a significant improvement. But the risk, of course, is that if every farmer shoulder to shoulder would go to a high productive system, you would still get an intensification, and the environment would, could still have a fairly high surplus of nitrogen within a river catchment. So what you do on farm and what the consequences are of that surplus really depends also how the larger context is. Where do we see these improvements? This is now talking about feeding pasture, not feeding cows. To grow grass, you need at least 20% crude protein. And most farmers here in Tasmania use 35 kilos of nitrogen fertilizer. If you would only take that into account for the amount of dry matter that in a rotational grazing cycle is being produced, this would can only result in about 14.5% crude protein. But that does not take into account a lot of nuances. So there's a lot of things that farmers can do to improve, to get to at least 20% crude protein, and can help in the nitrogen use efficiency. So using an inference of how much nitrogen actually comes available through cows. Keep in mind, they have a lot of excreta, that is nitrogen that is being left behind as feed for the pasture in piles and puddles. That's what they do, but some of it is effective, and that should be taken into account. And there can also be legumes that bind, and then there can be a few other sources. If this is used well and you spread the right amount of fertilizer in the right way, and with modern technology, with GPS and so on, that is possible, then it should be possible to actually get fairly accurate to the amount of nitrogen to grow your grass where you need to be. And you can see that here a little bit how we achieve that in our farmlets. We have our farmlets where the first farmlet is our control, where we have about 300 N per hectare per year. Farmlet 2 and 3 get half the amount. Farmlet 4 gets 0. All of them grow in each regrowth cycle the same amount. They all sit in crude protein around 23.5%. So in that amount of grass, you then have locked up about 56 kilos of nitrogen. Now, farmlet 4 grows a bit less, so does produce a few, 1 or 2 less of these regrowth cycles, but what they lock up is the same. And where is it then coming from? What we take into account is the nitrogen from synthetic fertilizer, the effective nitrogen dropped in the paddock by cows, and then we have some level of effective nitrogen from clover and other sources, and that brings us to this total amount of nitrogen that we have available. So as you see, in this case, we have a situation where if everything is managed well, you can keep your grass growing with trying to avoid excess nitrogen being surplus and lost to the environment. This is what I wanted to talk about today, and we'll leave the questions for later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Indeed, wonderful presentation, and indeed have lots of questions I can see in the Q&A function, but I will get to that at the end of the presentations. So I'd like to bring up our third speaker for today. Our third speaker for today is Paul Cheng. Paul is an associate professor in livestock nutrition and grazing management, and the coordinator for graduate research. He graduated from Lincoln University, New Zealand, with a Bachelor of Agricultural Science, Honours, and PhD in Animal Science, focusing on nitrogen metabolism biomarker development in ruminants. Paul then worked as an AgMats postdoctoral fellow investigating forage herbs for sustainable heifer production. Thank you, Paul, for joining us on today's forum, and I hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen, please?
Yes, yep. We can.
Perfect. Okay. Well, look, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. While Peter talked quite a bit about the system level of nitrogen use efficiency from the soil to the plant, what I really want to introduce to you and share with you today are 2 subtopics of nitrogen use efficiency. The first one is about use of plantain to increase nitrogen use efficiency and reduce urinary nitrogen pollution. Coming to the bigger picture, which is about sustainable development of our livestock production system, I think there are four major components of it. The first one is about production efficiency. The second one is about environmental protection. The third one is about economic viability. And the last one, but not the least one, is the social responsibility. And we can clearly see that from the pictures that I put up here. As Peter mentioned earlier, nitrogen use efficiency quite often can be low in our dairy production system. And what we also experience in our particular system here in Australia is the urine patch, depletion of urine on pasture land, which creates the opportunity for nitrogen loss to the environment. So what I really want to do is to focus today on the production efficiency and the environmental protection to talk about nitrogen use efficiency. This is a high-level, I guess, picture showing us the potential strategies for pasture nitrogen management. And it really ranges from the soil management to the plant management to the animal management. Coming out from the animal management, we also can see that there's a component of manure management, which Peter also mentioned that earlier. What I really want to drill into this exercise is to think about, use case studies to think about use of alternative forages compared with standard ryegrass, white clover pasture to increase nitrogen use efficiency and also to mitigate nitrogen pollution. This is the work that we published back a few years ago when I was in New Zealand, looking at the effects of feeding cod, plantain, and perennial ryegrass, white clover in a controlled environment, in an indoor environment, on dairy heifer feed and water intake, but also to look at the apparent nutrient digestibility, such as dry matter digestibility, and the nitrogen excretion in the urine, which we know that is a major pollutant. In terms of the methodology, what we had was 12 animals equally allocated into either the ryegrass or the plantain diet. And these animals were about 9 months-ish old and average body weight of 200 kilograms. They had a similar breeding worth of about $162 of New Zealand dollar. So they are equal allocated into two groups, if you like. With the feed data that we have, table 1, that you can clearly see that the pasture, in this case, perennial ryegrass and white clover, had a higher dry matter percentage compared with the plantain. In other words, plantain contained more water. These two diets were isonitrogen diet. In other words, they had similar nitrogen content in the feed. It is probably worthwhile to point it out that looking at the major minerals such as potassium and sodium, we can clearly see that the plantain had a higher mineral content there than the pasture. What actually happened in table 2 is the animal performance result. We can see that in terms of dry matter intake, there was no difference. In terms of nitrogen intake, there was no difference. But when it comes to forage water intake and the total water intake, we can clearly see that the plantain had a higher and probably much higher forage intake and the total water intake than the pasture group. And also we can see that from apparent dry matter digestibility point of view, plantain tended to provide a higher apparent dry matter digestibility, but that was not significant statistically or scientifically in this particular trial. Looking at the environmental pollutants and the nitrogen use efficiency, in this case, the urinary nitrogen concentration gram per kilogram of urine, plantain had a much lower concentration of urine nitrogen. This is probably because of plantain produced much more urine in terms of volume, kilogram per day, you can see here. And the predicted urinary nitrogen excretion from plantain was lower than the pasture. It is also interesting to note that in this case, we didn't perform a full nitrogen balance study. Therefore, we were not able to directly measure nitrogen use efficiency, but we did use a biomarker called plasma urea nitrogen. What happened to the plasma urea nitrogen is, generally speaking, they have a negative relationship with nitrogen use efficiency. In this case, plantain had a lower plasma urea nitrogen, meaning plantain had a possibly higher nitrogen use efficiency compared with pasture. Moving from the indoor trials to the paddock, testing some of the ideas that we just highlighted and discussed earlier in a paddock level. This is what we did for this particular study, looking at the live weight gain, urinary nitrogen excretion, and urination behavior of dairy heifers grazing pasture compared with chicory and compared with plantain. What we can see here is we had two trials, one in autumn and another one in spring. And when we had this pasture here, which is basically perennial ryegrass and white clover standard pasture, compared with the perennial ryegrass, white clover pasture, plus plantain, 50% each side, and plus pure plantain. We see that from autumn trial that there's a little bit of difference in terms of dry matter percentage from these three swards. Plantain tended to have a lower dry matter percentage, which is something we probably would expect based on what I discussed earlier. Similar nitrogen supply in terms of gram per kilogram of dry matter. For the spring trial, we can see that we also observed a dry matter, lower dry matter percentage from the plantain compared with the pasture. And for the nitrogen, you can see that 35, 31, 31 relatively close. Again, it's a scenario that we created that with a similar nitrogen supply, but differed in terms of the dry matter percentage in the feed. It's worthwhile to mention that for nitrogen intake, which is the last line here, 187 versus 148 versus 141, and same thing applies to this spring trial here. Autumn pasture was 32% more than the plantain, while the spring pasture was 55% more than the plantain, creating a bigger difference in terms of nitrogen intake or nitrogen supply from the spring trial than the autumn trial compared with pasture and the plantain sward. What we found from an animal performance point of view is in autumn trial, there was no difference in terms of the urinary nitrogen concentration and also the plasma urea nitrogen. That led to no difference in terms of predicted urinary nitrogen excretion. So we sort of rejected what we thought from the beginning based on the indoor trial. When we look at the spring trial, it pretty much followed what we hypothesized. In other words, we observed a lower urinary nitrogen concentration from the plantain compared with the pasture. And we also observed a lower urinary nitrogen excretion, that is a total gram per day per heifer from plantain compared with the pasture. So what we believe is seasonal difference is important to consider when it comes to use plantain strategically to manage nitrogen use efficiency and also urinary nitrogen excretion. And such seasonal difference in nitrogen excretion and the use efficiency may lead or relate to nitrogen intake. Again, I refer back to my earlier slides mentioning that autumn pasture was 32% more than plantain, while spring pasture was 55% more than the plantain in terms of nitrogen intake. These are the component trials that I just showed you, but bringing all the knowledge together, people from New Zealand perform something called a meta-analysis by bringing multiple trials together to look at the general pattern. And what they actually found is very interesting. Clearly, they see that when the plantain in the diet percentage-wise increase, we can see a relative change in urine nitrogen concentration reduction, and we can see a relative change in urine volume, which is increase, and we can see a relative change in total urine nitrogen excretion reduction. These are the cow trials looking at the milk production, looking at the urine nitrogen excretion. Moving on to the last one here is looking at the plantain use for cattle production, including some of the heifer trial data that I provided to you in the background earlier. And clearly, it shows us again from meta-analysis when plantain is included in the feed, as its percentage start to increase, there is an expected percentage of reduction in urinary nitrogen concentration. So I think what I can conclude here, based on probably close to 15 years of work in this space in New Zealand and Australia, is it seems like plantain does work to reduce urinary nitrogen and probably increase nitrogen use efficiency. But of course, from a research point of view, we also need to think about the urine distribution, we think about the patch size, and we think about the combination with other mitigation strategies. Those are the areas that we should research more into the future. Changing the topic a little bit, still stick on nitrogen use efficiency, but from a very different angle, which is think about the biomarker development to predict livestock nitrogen use efficiency. Here we're looking at the typical graph of intake nitrogen down the bottom and the nitrogen output on the y-axis. When we feed more than enough nitrogen, roughly about 450 grams per day to the dairy cows, what will happen is the excessive amount of nitrogen will be excreted in the urine. It's a very little gain, still gain, but limited gain in terms of milk nitrogen output and the fecal nitrogen output. So nitrogen use efficiency is important because it concerns feed efficiency, it concerns productivity on farm. Of course, it concerns the bottom line of the farm, which is a profitability and the social license to operate the farming system, including the pollution mitigation. Quite often we say that you can't manage what you can't measure. So this is exactly the situation for nitrogen use efficiency measurement. Traditionally, what we would do with nitrogen use efficiency is to put animal indoor, attach bags and tubes. Particularly for dairy cows, female animal, we have to separate the urine and feces to get the measurement right for nitrogen use efficiency and also for urinary nitrogen excretion. In our particular farming system, which is grazing based on pasture, it is very difficult to perform this. What we tend to do is to use a spot sampling, getting the animal in the crush and then sample them from time to time throughout the day. It's quite a labor-intensive process, and also it is a process that can be very, very costly and probably develop discomfort to the animal. So the question we ask ourselves is, what proxy, what biomarkers can we use, perhaps from blood and other animal samples, to indicate nitrogen use efficiency instead of going through this very lengthy and laborious exercise? This is a traditional biomarker that we know, and we know them well. For example, milk urea nitrogen here, which quite often gets routinely measured from milk pickup. But we can clearly see that in this particular case, we have two groups of animal Friesian versus Jersey Friesian. Regardless of which group of animal, we can see that when the nitrogen use efficiency become probably lower than 25%, which is 2.5, the points here, that you can clearly see that milk urea nitrogen start to plateau. In this case, that translates to the crude protein in the diet about 23%. In other words, when the crude protein is more than 23%, milk urea nitrogen is no longer a good indicator to nitrogen use efficiency. So what we proposed through my PhD work is the potential to use 15N to predict nitrogen use efficiency. This is because we know that through digestion and absorption in the body, 14N, which is a lighter N form with a lighter mass, reacts faster and form plasma urea pool. On the other hand, the heavier 15N is forming plasma amino acid pool. And we know that plasma urea pool and amino acid pool are the precursors of urine nitrogen and sellable products such as milk in this particular case. So by differentiating the change of 15N and 14N throughout the different parts of the body and the metabolic process, we may have the opportunity to use it to indicate how efficient the nitrogen is deposited for the sellable product in the body. This is looking at a sheep trial that you can clearly see that by putting number of trials together, when we measure plasma delta 15N, there is a negative relationship with nitrogen use efficiency. Moving to a cow trial, similar situation happens when we infuse the different levels of urea to create into the rumen to create different levels of nitrogen use efficiency. We believe such change of nitrogen use efficiency can be picked up and predicted by nitrogen isotopic fractionation, which is the delta 15N biomarker that I mentioned to you earlier. Putting international data together, we publish a meta-analysis. This analysis comprised the animal all the way from low nitrogen use efficiency to high nitrogen use efficiency, and ranging from small ruminant to large ruminants, and from growing animal to lactating animal. Altogether, you can clearly see that negative relationship is still pronounced when we measure the delta 15N from plasma, mostly in this case, and minus the diet delta 15N to indicate nitrogen use efficiency. So I think in conclusion, it seems like delta 15N is a better biomarker to indicate nitrogen use efficiency than our traditional marker. In this case, it's milk urea nitrogen. And it is particularly suitable for our system because it covers a wider range towards to the higher crude protein supply scenarios. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that wonderful presentation. So now we will switch to getting all the questions that are in the Q&A section answered. Let me get them up. So I have the first question here, and looks like it's been addressed to both you and Peter. It says, do you see the legislation will come in either at the Commonwealth level or at the Tasmanian level, introducing nitrate vulnerable zones as seen in Europe and also similarly in New Zealand, controlling nitrogen application rates on pastures in dairy farms or nitrogen emissions from other livestock enterprises?
You want me to reply first, Paul?
Yeah. Mostly to you. The question was mostly directed to you.
Yeah.
Paul can add as well.
There's always a chance. Part of the reason why we started our farmer trial is try and work out much more efficient use of inputs, and you increase the productivity so you export more and show basically best practice. Hopefully that helps in preventing the need for legislation. It still might mean that something might come. We hope that we can do the preventive side, but you have to keep in mind that a lot of it is about intensification. And if you look at how, for instance, the North Island, Canterbury Plains are, where dairy farms are shoulder to shoulder over a large area. These farms all were using a lot of land to grow grass. The soil is basically gravel with easy runoff and leaching ending up in river. That's where there's a high risk and you have to expect it. Just to describe another reason why the need for legislation is lower, that doesn't mean we won't get anything, but Europe has a lot of that legislation, but Europe is old country and very intensive. As an example, the Netherlands. The Netherlands is the area of 2/3 of Tasmania. There's what is now 18 million people living in that area. They produce more milk than all of Australia combined. And that's where the intensification then becomes an issue. So the conditions here are completely different in most areas in Australia compared to the examples provided in the question. So best practice by farmers might prevent. I hope so. I think the biggest driver for change will not be legislation, but access to market. To get access to market, farmers have to show that they have a sustainable way of producing. Paul showed a couple of extra reasons why you want to do things in a certain way. And I think the large corporate buyers of end products of our dairy or directly from our dairy, they will want to prove to their consumers that the milk was produced sustainable. I think that will be the biggest driver here in Australia.
Thanks, Peter. Paul, do you have anything to add to that? Or you want
Look, I fully endorse what Peter said there. I think it is important to look at this not just from a perspective of legislation, but also from gaining productivity and efficiency. And by the end of the day, that will flow into the profitability.
Thank you. Peter, this is also for you. What was the intention of the plantain in the farmlets? You said it didn't persist. Did it disappear pretty quickly?
Yeah. Paul nicely described at the cow level what improvements plantain can bring. New Zealand has done a lot of research showing these advantages. There was a meta study showing a lot of these effects. So if you look at what plantain does, it has the potential to increase the nitrogen use efficiency through the animal by diluting the nitrogen a bit, maybe even directing some of the N to manure and therefore less leaching. What it also does, it produces root exudes that slows down how nitrate is formed. So also at the soil level, it can reduce the risk of loss of nitrogen. So the overall benefit of plantain can be improvement of nitrogen use efficiency. For that, you have to have 25–30% plantain in the diet in the paddock, and that's what we had planned. But for uncertain reasons yet, we don't see as many. In our case, we don't see plantain surviving. So it has gone down. 3 years in, there's 3% plantain left. So plantain is not contributing in our case. That's why I didn't mention. But for the reasons as shown by Paul, that's the reason why we wanted it in. We just have to work out why it didn't survive. If you could do that, we might have an additional way of improving nitrogen use efficiency and then reduce synthetic N input again a little bit and improve sustainability.
Thanks, Peter. Let me jump to Paul. A follow-up question, probably related to the last one, and this for you, Paul, was the plantain in the diet, the entirety of the cow's diet. I'm not sure if that question is clear enough. It says, was the plantain in the diet the entirety of the cow's diet?
Yeah, I think the question probably asks how much plantain we had there. For the first indoor trial, compared with plantain versus perennial ryegrass white clover pasture, that was 100% plantain versus 100% pasture. Why we did that? We're not necessarily visualizing somebody will use plantain as 100% diet per se, but from a scientific point of view, we want to push the boundary very hard to understand the mechanisms, which I highlighted some of them. For example, plantain contains more water, perhaps that lead to a dilution of urine nitrogen because of higher volume of urine gets produced. For the second trial that I introduced to you, the grazing trial, yes, again, we had that PL representing 100% plantain. The other one, PA plus PL, if you remember that is 50% pasture plus 50% plantain.
Okay, a follow-up question again to you, Paul. Sorry if I missed it, but why did the plantain reduce nitrogen excretion and increase nitrogen use efficiency?
Sure. I think at an animal level, there are probably 3 reasons. One is, as I mentioned earlier, that the plantain contained more water, and that created opportunity for the animal to excrete more urine and diluting nitrogen in the urine as percentage. The second thing is plantain perhaps has the opportunity to better match its protein and energy profile in the rumen to create more microbial protein, and more microbial protein gets synthesized would lead to a lower nitrogen excretion or higher nitrogen use efficiency. The third thing there perhaps comes back to some of the trial that the people did, but not necessarily the one that I demonstrated today, is plantain sometimes has a higher energy content, which of course provide more fermentable energy in the rumen to support rumen function and production.
Wonderful. Peter, what is the potential to alter the feeding of grazing dairy cows to improve nitrogen utilization and efficiency? What is the most common value for NUE in dairy farms in Tasmania on a farm level?
Yeah. Okay, so in a pasture-based system, you will see that at the cow level, the nitrogen use efficiency will be on the lower side. And that is because in grass, there's a lot of protein. So probably 20%, 23% is where most farms would sit, I would say, at the cow level. And as I mentioned in my story, it does not necessarily mean that that is a problem. The surplus on itself, the loss per hectare, is where one should focus on. Now, to improve the nitrogen use efficiency, knowing that grass has a surplus of protein, what you can do is the supplements that you provide to cows, have them at a low protein. So that gives two types of opportunities. What we do in our trial, our grain that we feed only has on average around 13, the concentrate is mostly grain-based, has a crude protein concentration of only around 13%. So we bring the average diet crude protein down by feeding a supplement of low protein, and your concentrate is the best one, and that's quite often grain-based here. Now, one of the things that you see in a seasonal calving dairy system, which is used here mostly, cows calve in spring. They have a high appetite for grass in spring when there's a lot of grass growing. Late lactation is when it is autumn, but in autumn you quite often see that there's still a decent grass growth happening. The appetite of the cows will be a little bit higher. There's a small feed gap, which coincides with protein in grass being highest. We quite often see that autumn is the time of the year when protein of the grass is highest. That supplement that you feed could be, for instance, a very low crude protein product. A very nice product would be something like maize silage that only has 7% crude protein. If you would feed that 2-3 kilogram matter, that would actually fit well. The only problem is that our systems are not set up. The land that we have is undulating, so it's not as easy to grow maize. So it's not a suitable system to fill a forage feed gap with low protein maize silage. But on itself, it would significantly improve the cow level nitrogen use efficiency.
Okay, one more question for you before I jump back to Paul. Does the farm-led trial mean that we can no longer use nitrogen fertilizer on dairy farms in Tasmania as per farm-led 4?
We still have a lot of unanswered questions. What it does show that you, as a farmer, have a choice. If you would change to a system with no nitrogen fertilizer input, it does come with the consequences, and we are starting to see that in our trial over multiple years, that the pasture production will go down. And therefore, you can have less cows per hectare. So compared to a system where you reduce, say, half the nitrogen fertilizer and have legumes in it to bring in some nitrogen derived from air, you still have a slightly lower productive system. But that doesn't mean that zero nitrogen cannot be a profitable system. At the moment, what we see, the challenge is in how do you achieve that you get 20-30% clover in your paddocks, and how do you maintain that over many years? That's still the unknown question, and that's further research that we are planning now to get answers to these questions. for us, what we can see, if you have a significant component of clover as a legume, which derives some N from air into your system, if you have that significantly in there, you truly can reduce the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer input. The optima, that's still to be determined. As I said, it's all preliminary what we are talking about this year still to come, and only then we have stronger conclusions.
Yep.
So the optimum is probably somewhere in the middle.
Thank you, Peter. Paul, there's a question here for you. It says, you propose 15N as a potential proxy for nitrogen efficiency. How does this compare cost and labor-wise to other potential proxies that proxy threats for nitrogen use efficiency? For example, other approaches such as using milk meat infrared spectroscopy to predict nitrogen in milk/blood plasma have also been proposed.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that's a very valid question. In terms of the cost-wise, I would probably think it doubles the traditional milk urea nitrogen methodology. And remember that the milk urea nitrogen or plasma urea nitrogen methodology has been developed way back, compared with 15N, which is only just recently been developed over the last probably 10 years, I would say, or 15 years. So I would think, if the application opportunity is there, the cost can come down, because what we use to measure the 15N is the mass spec, which is quite a traditional, if you like, equipment that most of the laboratory, most of the university would have. So it's not a new piece of equipment. It's an old piece of equipment. But if the equipment doesn't get enough samples, obviously the cost can be high. On the other hand, if the equipment gets enough samples, the cost can go down. I think what we probably should focus on is the limitation of milk urea nitrogen. If we do believe that limits our prediction of nitrogen use efficiency, particularly when it comes to monitoring the farm nitrogen use efficiency, and also the breeding side of the exercise of dairy cows, I think we need to really explore alternative methodologies or proxies to indicate nitrogen use efficiency, such as 15N.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, would you recommend that dairy beef sheep farmers include plantain in their pasture sorts?
I think there's enough body of evidence to say that if you want to include plantain into your sward, as Peter also mentioned, at a level of 20–30%-ish, you should expect a reduction of urinary nitrogen and improvement of nitrogen use efficiency. However, that does not answer the agronomy part of the question, such as how long the plantain will be there and how good the plantain will compete with other species, particularly under the ever-changing climate scenarios these days. I think that is probably more of a pasture side of the question rather than the livestock side of the question.
Thank you. Peter, there's a question here for you in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Which is the most important in each of the farmlets, methane emissions or nitrous oxide emissions? Presumably nitrous oxide emissions were much lower in farmlet 4.
This experiment was not set up to measure methane emissions. I think nitrogen oxide, but I'll give a response to that anyway in a sec. The nitrogen oxide emissions, we assume is higher in farmlet 1, the conventional system, because there is some nitrogen derived from air, as we can see. And what we do in that system, as conventionally happens, is drop 30 kilos of nitrogen per hectare in one hit. And the other farmlets, 2 get half and some none. So the spreading out the amount of nitrogen input over time is much better in the other one. So I assume the highest risk is in farmlet 1. Water is also a point that is of importance. In our farmlets, we have them fully irrigated, so the soil moisture levels are similar for all farmlets. So the only difference that I can then look at is the input, and that is farmlet 1. Now, on the methane side, we actually hope to be able to investigate using green feeds what the methane emissions are. We think that the methane production of our cows, and methane is at the cow level, is probably very similar for all 4 farms. And that is based on the fact that the nitrogen treatments that we have in our farmlet might create in farmlet 4 species, that's a multi-species mix, might create grass that has more NDF, but NDF is the biggest driver for increasing methane emissions. What we do see, however, is that the cows in farmlet 4 do a lot of selective grazing. They grab grass, leaves, and they grab the clover, and clover has a much lower NDF. Now, if what they have found in Europe so far is true, we expect per kilo dry matter eaten, our farmlet systems, so for all 4 about similar, having a lower methane emission per kilo dry matter eaten compared to the standard value used by Australia. I think Australia sits at 21.7 grams of methane per kilo dry matter or thereabouts. What Europe has found that if you go to grass, that actually grass-based diet sits lower than 27, and high quality grass-based diets might even be as low as 17 or something like that. So we hope to explore that further. We are actually negotiating getting some green feeds here, so we hope to be able to get that done. And then we hope to be able to show that per kilo dry matter these systems, because of the on average lower NDF, have a lower methane emission. And given the high milk production per cow for our pasture-based system, the methane emission intensity, so per liter of milk produced or kilo of milk solids, as we say here, there might well be a very significant advantage. In our system, the feed conversion efficiency, so how much dry matter is needed to produce a liter of milk, sits at around 1.4. The industry average is probably only 1.2 liters per kilo dry matter. So that is already 7% or so difference that we have an advantage. So I think apart from nitrogen, that on the methane side, the farmlets that we have running might actually have an advantage both from an emission per kilo dry matter and an emission of methane per kilo of milk solids or liter of milk produced.
Thank you, Peter. I'll just follow up with you again with one more question before I go back to Paul. The TIA farmlet trial had MUN values that were high, for example, 20 milligrams per deciliter. Yeah. Suggesting from your graph an inefficient use of nitrogen, but the same trials had NUE that were very efficient, up to 60% in farmlet 4. How would you interpret the difference?
What you do see is that there's 2 components to the nitrogen use efficiency: the cow level, and at the cow level you have limitations. If the diet goes higher in crude protein, and we can have a higher, and that's what we see in our farmlets, the cow level nitrogen use efficiency is lower. But ultimately, because it's a system that you have, the cows graze on farmlet most of their diets, we have to look at it at the farm level, at the systems level, so per hectare. And in our case, that nitrogen is only lost if it's not properly recycled back into the paddock. So with these cows behind me, if you look at them, they are eating grass. They convert some of that to milk and growth, meat, or whatever you want to call it. The rest comes out their backside, and only then there's a risk of loss. And if we can reduce that risk of loss, that's where the efficiency improvement can occur and we can gain benefits. And Paul was talking about plantain. Our idea was if we have plantain mixed in, we can increase the use efficiency of the nitrogen dropping in the paddock. And therefore, at the cow level, we lost a little bit, but at the paddock level, we gained again. And overall, we are actually off better. I think that is what is happening. And one of the things that I've observed from Europe is that the license to produce, the commercial demand to have a sustainable system as is required by consumers and therefore from companies that buy a lot of the dairy products. In Europe, they are setting up systems to develop KPIs that monitor sustainability, loss to the environment and so on. Farmers are actually positively using it because your first gain, the low-hanging fruit, is increasing the use efficiency. Paul clearly alluded that in the start of his story that that is an important factor. And that's what our farmed cows actually do. The feed conversion efficiency to convert feed eaten into milk actually improves maybe even 15% or whatever it is. And that's a direct gain in whatever way you look at it, also profit. You don't have to invest money and you have more to sell. That improves profit without creating an environmental risk, actually reducing the environmental risk.
Thanks, Peter. Paul, there's a question following up on your response with the 15N. Can 15N be used to predict feed conversion efficiency in cows at different stages of lactation?
You on mute?
Sorry, yeah, thank you. That's a very valid question. The short answer is yes. Obviously, today's exercise focused on nitrogen use efficiency, urine nitrogen, so I didn't put that into my PowerPoint. But yes, once we figure out that 15N can be used to predict nitrogen use efficiency, the logical question followed up with that is, can we use that to predict feed conversion efficiency? Because we know that nitrogen use efficiency is a major contributor to the feed conversion efficiency. The recent work we have done globally indicate that 15N is reasonably reliable to predict feed conversion efficiency, particularly when it comes to the growing animal. For the lactating animal, it's very much depending on if we are looking at a later stage of the lactation or the early stage of lactation. The challenge there with the early stage of lactation, as we all know, is the animal tends to mobilize the body reserve, which creates extra nutrient go into the system that may not necessarily be picked up by the 15N signal.
Thank you. Peter, you mentioned nitrate isn't as much of an issue in Tasmania, but what about nitrogen emission losses in our waterlogged soils?
When I was talking about Australia, I wasn't trying to state that there were no issues anywhere. I used Tasmania as an example to compare the Netherlands with, where the milk production is 12 times of what's in Tasmania. What you can have, and that's, I think, even what I showed in my presentation, the case, if you have a lot of area with a lot of cows in a very intensive system, in a dense area close together in one river catchment, you do have a risk. And I can imagine that there are some areas in Tasmania where that might be a risk. On top of that, of course, you can have, especially over winter, a lot of rainfall that saturates the soil where there's a high risk of nitrogen oxide going to the air. So we do have some risks. It is understanding them and managing them, and we can improve on that, I think. You have in spring choices for fertilizer that are much more slow release. You can have some other additives, so there are some improvements possible to increase the use efficiency of it and reduce the loss to the environment. If that is going to be enough, I don't know. I don't have all of that data, but we can still make improvements. But wherever you are, if you are in a river catchment with a lot of cows, a lot of farms that are very intensive in their system, there is a risk. It also depends on other things what you are trying to achieve. One of the things you do see that in Tasmania, because of that high rainfall, soil erosion and therefore soil washing off into rivers and therefore causing an environmental issue also can be of risk. And if you have pastures, that risk is much smaller. So there's always a upside to a downside. And as I describe it quite often, it is not about what you do, but how you do it. And I think as farmers, we have the choice to just do the way we like it and the wrong way, or as farmers, we have the choice to do it how we should be doing it in a sustainable way with a high use efficiency so that we save cost and still have a very productive system. So I think if the right mentality is applied, the risks are smaller. I don't have any position if we can get to, we don't need any legislation. Let's first start with the carrot and let's hope we can avoid the stick. That's for others to decide.
All right. Thank you. We still have a few more questions to go through, so I'll ask if you can respond to the rest of the questions in a minute or less so that we can cover all of them as much as possible. That would be wonderful. Again, I'm coming back to you, Peter. What do you think is the lowest hanging fruit for Tasmanian farmers to increase nitrogen use efficiency?
Apply the right amount of nitrogen. Take into account how much nitrogen is effectively available from your cows and from clover in your paddock. That is your first low-hanging fruit, much more precise. And then apply that correctly with GPS technology so that it drops where it needs to be.
Thank you. Paul, given the balance between persistence of plantain in swaths, the cost of sowing it, and the improvements in nitrogen efficiency, is it a cost-effective option? If not, can you suggest how it might become a cost-efficient option?
That's a million-dollar question, really, and the answer probably varies depending on where you are in terms of location, climate condition, etc., and what you are currently using. My understanding, again, from my New Zealand colleagues, is plantain adoption in New Zealand has been pretty successful. And what people really like about that is as soon as you start to use, the more you grow, the longer you use it, I guess people start to become master of how to manage it. Let's not forget that the history of perennial ryegrass and white clover, we have had them in our sward for many, many years. It didn't just magically come with a package that we know how to manage it straight away. It takes so many years to get us to the point that we're comfortable to use it and understand how to manage the risk. I think the same thing would apply to plantain. The best thing probably is to talk to the local agronomist or the neighbor who had some experience to using that and work out the budget accordingly with a sort of back of the envelope calculation, I would think. And it's not hard, by the way, to find some literature and the data to support the thinking and to put the number into the modeling tools to look at what could potentially be achieved.
Thank you, Paul. Peter, someone is asking if they are right in understanding that to get the full benefit of a multi-species grass type for nitrogen fixing, you need to apply less synthetic nitrogen, as the legumes seem to have a preferred level in the soil and will fix less if it is being added by fertilizer.
Yeah, this is probably about how clover can survive. First of all, you need active rhizobia in the nodules on the root. So when you establish clover, seed clover, you have to make sure that you inoculate the seed so that that's available. When you have the rhizobia in the soil, of course, you have to give clover space to grow. And what clover is sensitive for is being shaded out by ryegrass. And that is mostly happening in spring. So if in spring you start off with normal nitrogen fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer rates, ryegrass grows fast, the clover loses that competition. And that is what you normally see over time. You see that the clover just disappears. So to maintain a high level of clover, it does help if you reduce the amount of synthetic nitrogen. We have chosen for halving, and that seems to be working quite okay. It might well be that we can go down a bit further to get to the right level. That's still to be explored. As I mentioned, our main questions are still how to establish these higher levels of clover and how to maintain. But of course, indeed, reducing the synthetic nitrogen input will help significantly.
Thank you. So this would be last question, because I'll get the two of you to respond to it. And probably Jo, if Jo wants to add as well to it. So the question is it appropriate to target both nitrous oxide and methane emissions simultaneously in dairy systems? Yeah, any of us can go for it.
Doing one thing and achieving both might be a bit challenging. I think what you can do is at the same time manage both. I think the most important part is focus on use efficiency even from feed. Do everything to a level to be as precise as possible. And then I think for nitrous oxide, you already are fair way. For methane, the main part will be that you have to manage the amount of fiber in the diet to have a simple system. With methane, of course, there are also some additives that are available already to reduce methane one way or another. Given with methane, we do have a short cycle system where the carbon dioxide that was locked up in grass is what cows eat is turned into methane that over time becomes carbon dioxide again and is back in your grass again. But 30% might be possible as a maximum within cows. I don't think it will be easy to get further than that. Paul?
Well, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you. I endorse what Peter said. I think it's a right question to ask. If I can push the thinking a little bit further for the audience, is be careful that the mitigation strategy that you choose to apply on your farm may or may not create a scenario that is called carbon swapping, and that way you decrease methane, but perhaps increase nitrous oxide. There are some international evidence, for example, use high sugar grass to reduce nitrogen pollution. But the evidence basically shows if you are not careful and know how to use it, it can increase methane emission. So I think it is important to take both nitrous oxide or nitrogen, in this case, and methane into account to calculate the total greenhouse gas emission.
Thank you very much, Paul. Unfortunately, that's the much of the questions that we can take on today's forum. If you have any other question, you might reach out to us, and probably we'll be able to get it across to Pieter and Paul, and probably they might be able to respond to those questions as well directly to you. But in all cases, I want to thank you all for joining us in today's TIA Future Forum. And I hope that you will also join me in thanking our speakers today for wonderful presentations and that we've received from them or gotten from them. Before you leave, please take a moment to complete a short feedback poll on your screen right now. And we'll greatly appreciate if you can do that for us. Thank you very much for taking part in today's event, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.